Hey guys, I'm back at it again, and we are actually here to talk about the infamous Bioshock Infinite, where it all starts with the people who made the first game was also making the sequel. Even during Bioshock 2 development time, they did go back to Rapture, but decided with going to the sky since they felt restrained and that they felt like it was time for something new. They did show multiple gameplay trailers demonstrating the outright game mechanic that we did not get to see in the final version, which I'll go more into later. But I just have to say, the early gameplay for this game was honestly amazing, and it's actually very sad that none of it really came to light. In fact, most of it got pretty much scrapped, you could say, or just got downgraded, which, yeah, so far, you can probably already tell how I'm going to feel about this game. We open up with a man named Booker that has some kind of debt, and the only way to clear it is to bring this girl named Elizabeth back with him alive. Next thing we know, we are up in the skies. We see that somehow we are what they call a false shepherd, the one who will rule them all. We eventually meet the prophet, the villain of the story, which is just another character that views him in a godlike way. His goal is just to kill us and keep Elizabeth for himself. We finally meet Elizabeth, who's been tricked into coming with us since she's a little bit of a sheltered girl. We eventually find out she can rip stuff into existence from another world. Shortly after finding this out, she actually finds us out, our true intentions. But we eventually come to an agreement to help each other out. This machine called a songbird was actually sent by the prophet to actually capture her and bring her back to him, which he succeeds in doing so. We try to go after her, but we eventually find ourselves in another world that Elizabeth is aged to a very old lady, showing us a distant future where we actually didn't get a chance to save her. She actually brings us back to the present time. She also teleports us to where she's at so we can actually save her, unlocking all of Elizabeth's powers. We go to Comstock, the name of the actual villain, and Booker actually ends him in pure rage. And his final words is, ask him what happened to your finger. Now, this is something I haven't talked about yet, but there's actually a little bit of a dialogue between the two where they actually ask, they actually talk about Elizabeth's finger and how she doesn't actually know, and that so far she was just born with it, but that's also not said to be true. As soon we find out the truth after destroying the tower she was locked up in, and she tells Booker about what happened. Now, there was a major debt he needed to be settled with, but he actually gave up his baby named Anna. He later regrets this and tries to get her back from Comstock, actually. And when doing so, there's this portal that opens up and he's trying to go through it, but Booker tries to stop him by grabbing onto the baby, and he actually lets go, and the portal actually closes on him, cutting the baby's pinky, showing that Elizabeth is actually Booker's daughter. And he just doesn't remember this because now here's the whole downside to the story, I would say. Elizabeth takes Booker to the time room, I call it, showing us the multiple timelines and how they all the same. Booker is taken to a baptism as he tells everyone he's actually Booker and Comstock. He tries to leave, but multiple Elizabeth actually decide to end his life, and the credits roll. So they actually put a lot of work into the story this time to where the gameplay itself takes a major hit. Now, I do like the story. I like how it's actually focused on a little bit more compared to the other games. As Johnny Versus tells us, time travel can be a very touchy and bullshit plot device if handled poorly. If you don't keep it as something simple as Dragon Ball Z and not fucking Dragon Ball Super, I'm not even talking about that shit. Now, you notice how I said multiple timelines? The game actually never tells you this. They just keep it as like different worlds and shit like that. Never actually telling you multiple timelines because I guess it just views the player as being dumb or just not outright understanding that concept. I'm not really sure. And in doing so, they make it more complex than it actually needs to be. I even had an old coworker who I talked about the game prior to this, and he actually had no idea what the fuck was going on. He just eventually said fuck it and just outright forgot the ending until I actually reminded him about it. And I'll admit, when I first played this game, I even had a little bit of confusion myself not really understanding what the fuck just happened and what the fuck I just saw until I eventually started thinking about it and I was like, oh wait, now it makes sense. Which, that's really dumb that you have to actually do that instead of understanding it as it unravels. Especially when you consider the thought that if you look up Bioshock Infinite, the first thing that pops up in the search bar, regardless of whether you look it up on Google or YouTube, is Bioshock Infinite story explanation, which that just goes further into my point on how you know your story's a little bit too complex if people need to fucking look up a summarized or explained version of what they just saw. Now, going back to Booker being dunked in the water, I know it just sounds like I just skipped like why they did that. So this is where I call bullshit because Elizabeth says that there's always constants and variables and how everything's the same but a little bit different. In the actual game, there's a universe, or I guess a timeline, where Booker becomes a revolutionary leader and he actually leads the revolution against not Comstock, but another character who the name escapes me, but he wasn't really important, so I'll just go ahead and let it slide. And he actually dies a hero. So already they just debunked themselves into this. And the thing is, Elizabeth understands like everything. She actually pretty much became self-aware of all of this as soon as she unlocked her true powers after destroying the tower. And yet, she decides not to make a new path, but decide to go just full circle with her own, killing Booker in the process, even though she could totally just prevent him becoming Comstock, but she doesn't do that for some reason, and you don't really explain it when even in the DLC, which I don't really talk about because I didn't actually decide to play it because I just didn't particularly want to because it's just not very really worth talking about. But even in the DLC, they do show characters pretty much denying their path, and yet for the main story, they just don't, and they don't really give a really good explanation except constant variables, which once again making it a little bit too complex and just not outright explaining things that you need to do explain. And the fact that an older version of herself actually decided to deny the path that she was given, like I said beforehand, she actually sent Booker back into time. This, but this time actually gave him to advantage. Reminding me more of how this kind of is like a dumbass storyline. Also reminding me of another dumbass storyline, Marvel's Civil War 2, where they kind of did the same thing into just seeing the future and it being a 50-50 shot and just outright considering it a fact and an unavoidable event where it's actually totally avoidable, but they just decide to make it not avoidable, just really dumb. In the overall story, which could have been honestly pretty good, just have a very shit ending and giving you this very sour taste that honestly, every time you remember the story, you always have to think about the ending and just go, what the fuck? This time around, since this game actually takes place before everything, Plasma or Eve, but actually Vigor and Salt. That's pretty much just a precursor to all of it. Most of the Vigors are just the worst powers throughout the entire franchise. Most of them just being the exact same, just a different stats element. Compared to the previous games, had more creativity to them. I view it as more lazy than anything. Even though they could have just copy and paste them and it would have been no problem. Weapons also take another major change in that you can only carry two at one time, where you were constantly swapping out weapons and just doing all this and that. A very fluid flow compared to 1 and 2. In this one, it just takes a very staggered hit in that department. Now, you can still swap out weapons like that just by holding down the X button whenever you do get a new weapon. But in the previous one, it was just so much more simple. You could just hit a button, move the R stick, and boom. In this one, you actually have to find the weapon, hold the X button, gotta find ammo for it. If it's empty, it's just really, a very major hit in the actual flow of things. And it makes me wonder why they actually took away the weapon wheel when there was really no problem to it. I heard that they did it because it was a little bit more easy, which no the fuck it wasn't, because there's actually difficulty options in 1 and 2 and in Infinite. So I didn't really consider that being a thing, which if it was, you can totally just play the game or just make a new file and just put it on hard mode. Just that way you're erasing that problem of it being too easy because of a weapon wheel. Even Janes have been given another major rework, and they actually decided to call them gear in this one. You have 4 slots compared to the literally like 20 slots compared to the other ones. So yeah, already not off to a good start with that. And most of them are good, but it's the fact that you can only have the 4 slots into 4 categories. So you have the hat, the shirt, the pants, and then the shoes or whatever. So you can only equip 1 shoe slot, and you're given like 6 of these. And some of them are actually really good, but like I said, considering the amount of slots you have, it just doesn't work half the time. And you might be swapping in and out or just keeping the same ones because you just said fuck it instead of constantly swapping in and out and etc. And most of them are just very combat influenced now and not the actual diverse genes in 1 and 2. On its own, it's a cool idea, I guess. It's a little bit rocky. Comparing it to the previous two, I just can't help but look at it as another downgrade. Now, the actual new mechanic they decided to add is a shield, which, it definitely does its job. I don't think it was mandatory to have, but it is definitely useful. I would have to compare it to the Halo games, to where if you're shot at or even attacked with a melee weapon, you won't take any real damage until that shield actually goes away. And as soon as you stop taking damage for a couple seconds, you start regaining the shield. So it is a nice thing to have here and there. But half the time, even when you do upgrade the shield, it never feels like you're actually upgrading the amount you can take, except you're just upgrading the bar and how it actually looks aesthetically. I considered it no change from when I first unlocked the shield to compare it to when I boosted it like 7 times. The new melee weapon for this game is actually the claw machine that lets you hook on skylines and grind on them like in Sonic games. Or, like I said, you can hang on it like in the Batman Arkham games or any other Zelda game that has a hook shot, giving you a high advantage point. But something they don't explain that I find honestly hilarious is that these characters have fucking hops. Like, they're jumping like 80 feet in the air to even grab on a skyline or even on a fucking hook. And every time I see them jump or even fall down, I'm like, what the fuck? And the crazy thing is, there's fall damage in the game, but they won't take fall damage when you drop off from like an 80 feet height. Now, I did mention Elizabeth being a part in the story, and she is a part of the actual gameplay. Now, before you get any Resident Evil 4 flashbacks, this is nothing like that game. Elizabeth does not have any health, and you don't have to worry about her actually taking any damage. It's literally just you have to worry about, which I like how the developers actually thought about that, and honestly, could have been a lot worse if they actually didn't think about it. Now, she can actually do stuff outside of combat, which I find honestly pretty useful, but also find not as useful. The one I don't find as useful is the locking mechanism. So you can just unlock doors and safes, but half the time it's just not worth it because it's either just money that honestly you won't use a lot if you're only using 2 weapons that you're constantly staying with. Because, like I said, the weapon changing mechanic is just not that good. Along with, you can upgrade your plasma with money, but most of the plasmas are the same, so you're probably just going to either use just 1 or 2. So you're going to leave yourself to having like $10,000 at the end of the game. which is why I consider this locking mechanic just not the overall best thing. You can find boost upgrades to each one, but it's like half the time it's just random, and half the time when you do unlock something, there's like nothing there, so it's like, what's the point? It's a 50-50 shot, and the fact that you have a certain amount of resource to actually do it, and you have to look for more as you play the game, just makes you wonder what was the point. Now, the other thing that I actually do consider very useful, and I did lie, you can actually use this in combat as well, is if you do accidentally skip money, Elizabeth will actually toss it at you. Same for any health or ammo that you could be low on, and salt even, which is actually pretty fun when you're actually going guns blazing and you're low on health and you actually don't have any around you, and Elizabeth just says, "Here, catch," and you catch it, and you're back in the fight. So that's something to compliment at the very least. I've been saying throughout this entire video, this game is just a step back gameplay wise, which now, if it's story is actually okay besides the ending, like I said beforehand. But since this is a video game and the gameplay is pretty much just as important, if not more important, as a story, it just fails in that department. Making everything you think about, every mechanic, you always have to think about the previous two and how they always did it way more better than this one. The early on gameplays, which you can just look up on YouTube, you can even see it in those that the gameplay was honestly a lot more complex, a lot more fluid, and just overall great. Elizabeth being more of a combat partner than a standby partner, making it a lot more interesting on how she could have reacted to each of your plasmas and even giving you a little bit of a boost effect to it. Really makes me wonder why they actually had to cut it out into the point where we pretty much just got a very lazy version of Bioshock 1 and 2 to the point where I would only recommend this game if you played it first and then you played 1 and 2. That's honestly pretty bad to have to say that you can only enjoy this game if you play it the first time in the whole franchise. So that way, when you do play the other two, you just praise those more and you kind of shit more on the Infinite one, which is honestly pretty pathetic, but that's just how it is. Sometimes these things do happen where there's just a major shot in development, which the development history was very complex considering they did have a little bit of a time restraint and money restraint since they did carry it on a little bit too much. But with that, have a good morning, good night, wherever you're at. If it's your birthday, happy birthday, and I hope you have a peaceful day. And next time, we'll talk about a certain book called The Three Vias Raccoonus.